All right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a fun little treat for you guys. It's something that it's been a while, but I have had my guest on the show before, at least a couple times, I think. David Pallmann. So, hey, Dave, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I think the last time you were on the show was that the intelligent design debate or was it the epistemology one? I don't know if you remember.
I remember them. I'm trying to remember if I remember which one was last. Yeah, probably the epistemology one, because I think the intelligent design one was my first, but it's been so long ago at this point, I don't even remember.
Yeah, I think you are right. Yeah, because it was we were on this that was the show with David Russell and stuff, right? So yeah, we were getting into the epistemology debate on that front. But for today, I wanted to bring David back on to kind of discuss the issue of the rationality of miracles. This is a topic that both he and I are passionate about. I'm a philosopher, so I love understanding. What is the epistemic credentials for miracles? What are the criteria for them? Are we rational in believing them and stuff like that? But yeah, Dave, just before we get into today's topic, I just want to turn it over to you, and you want to tell the audience what you've kind of been up to since the last time you were on the show.
Yeah, I mean it's been so long that I guess a lot has happened. I've moved from New York to Illinois. Found a woman out here, fell in love, got married. So
Congrats.
yep. Well, actually, in June, coming up on a year of being married already. So yeah, life's snowballing. On the YouTube channel, done a full series defending, ultimately presenting my case for Christianity over the course of 2 years, broadly starting from arguing that the canonical Gospels were not anonymous, but were actually authored by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to the topic we'll be talking about today, which is, tearing down objections to the rationality of belief in miracles, defending the historicity of Acts, defending several arguments for the reliability of the New Testament, defending the proposition that early Christians actually were persecuted, that some of the apostles were martyred, and ultimately culminating in a 6-hour video for defending the resurrection of Jesus, which I know is a favorite topic of yours as well. I did a series arguing for the existence of the soul. And more recently, although this might not be of as much interest to your audience, but recently been doing a little bit of a deep dive into the Crusades, just because I happen to love the history of that era, and there's a lot of misinformation, shall we say, surrounding them. So I thought I'd take it upon myself to kind of respond to some of that, and kind of in ways that are relevant, I think, to Christian apologetics, because atheists like to sort of use wars of religion as arguments to the effect that religion is dangerous and violent and we'd all be better without it. So those are some of the projects I've been up to in the significant interval of time since I was last on here.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and believe it or not, I would be interested in listening to your series on the Crusades because I had Alan Rule on the show, and he's very much into the medieval history and looking at the primary sources there on the Crusades and stuff. So yeah, I think I actually have done a show on that topic and stuff. So yeah, so that's great. So yeah, so with today, obviously we're going to be looking at this issue of miracles and that sort of thing. So I think the first place to start is from an ontological perspective. What are miracles in the first place? Like, what are these types of events in your opinion? Because there are a variety of interpretations or definitions of them. So, where do you stand?
Yeah, I think this is good, and it's good to distinguish, I think, the ontological question from the epistemological question. So the ontological question, we're not talking about the conditions under which we're justified in believing in a miracle. We're just talking about what are the necessary conditions for an event to be considered a miracle. And so I think as a first approximation, Timothy and Lydia McGrew give us a pretty good definition in their contribution to the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. There, they stipulate that a miracle is an event that would not have happened had only the natural order been in operation. Natural order there is sort of just taken to refer to the physical world, physical objects, the interactions between physical objects, physical processes. as well as agents and the actions and interactions of agents, animals, and perhaps other agents that would have capacities similar to our own, say like maybe aliens that we, would have somewhat similar capacities to ours. Now, I think that that's a helpful start for the definition, but I'd like to add a little bit more to that. I want to add that these are supposed to function as divine signs, the way that, say, philosophers like Robert Larmer do. So to sort of distill it down to the most basic way I could put it, I would say I take a miracle to be a naturally impossible event that confirms a message that's from God. So ontologically, I think that's what a miracle is.
Awesome. I'm just kind of curious as a follow up. So this isn't on my list, but I'm just kind of curious because I know some people, when they're defining miracles, some have tried to stay away from like a distinction between natural and supernatural, and they say, well, these are enlightenment categories that, like in the Bible, the Bible author's mind, they wouldn't have thought in terms of natural and supernatural and the distinction on that front. Like, have you any thoughts on like objections from people on that front, or?
Yeah, I myself am not the biggest fan of the natural supernatural distinction, and that's not to do with anything like whether this is how biblical people would have thought, but rather I'm not sure that the distinction is all that well defined in the first place. Just ask people what is meant by natural, and you'll get so many different answers. Sometimes this is equated with things that are physical. But then you've also got philosophers who claim to be naturalists, but they're Platonists, right? They believe in abstract objects. So they think that those are a natural kind of thing. So it's just not clear, like what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a thing to be natural? Some people seem to just mean like anything that exists, in which case like God could end up being a natural thing. So it's not a particularly clear distinction between natural and supernatural. That's why I'm not overly fond of it. But I think we can sort of stipulate definitions here. So sort of like I did when I referred to the natural order in my definition, I just made clear the sorts of things that I had in mind there and distinguished that from the actions of God. So I think it's fine in terms of the definition that I offered because I was attempting to be clear as to what I meant by the term.
Awesome. All right, cool. So kind of switching gears then. So we kind of understand what a miracle is, ontologically speaking. But then, like you said, there is this epistemic question, in terms of, okay, we as human beings, when are we ever rational in believing, oh, this event is a miracle or versus a natural anomaly? So I'm kind of curious, do you think there are any criteria or a set of a set of criteria by which we're rational in identifying a certain event as a miracle versus just an anomaly or some kind of weird natural event?
Yeah, well, and so some of this is going to come down to the different ways for the different sources. So, for example, I think experience, you can know something, an event is a miracle by directly experiencing it, as well as, knowing that this is a naturally impossible event that is, seemingly confirmatory of some sort of divine message. But generally, that's not how most of us know about miracles. Primarily, we know about them on the basis of testimony. And so I think this is sort of a question for the epistemology of testimony. And so my own thesis for this, when I think that we could be justified in believing testimony in general, and of course, believing in miracles in particular, is when the probability of the truth of a proposition is higher than either the probability that the testimony is a lie or that it's just honestly mistaken. So if you've got reasonably good reasons to believe that the testimony is that it's not honestly mistaken, that it's not a deliberate lie, then that just leaves you with that it's going to be true. And I think there's something to be said for sometimes there's specific reasons to think that testimony is true as well. For example, when it's coming from a source that has a great track record of reliability and things like that. And notice this is just general. Like this is generally for testimony in general. It's not, there's nothing here like gerrymandering that we have different rules for miracles or anything like that. I think that this is just how we should be assessing testimony in general. And while we might want stronger reasons in the case of believing something that's miraculous. We might want stronger reasons for thinking that it's not honestly mistaken or thinking that it's not a deliberate lie. Generally, I would approach it in much the same way as I would any other claim from a source.
Interesting. And I'm just kind of curious about your take on this because I've asked a couple people when it comes to testimony. Obviously, that's something that is going to be important when we come to David Hume later on and stuff. But um, I've so when I took my epistemology grad seminar, we kind of learned about this epistemology of testimony area or discipline, and there are different positions, right? There's like a reductionism position on testimony, meaning that we're not justified in believing testimony unless we have independent, non-testimonial reasons for believing it first. And then there's a non-reductionist thing. So that's kind of like Richard Swinburne's principle of testimony. Testimony is itself a basic form of evidence that provides justification or warrant in its own right. I'm just curious, like, have you heard of that debate before? And if you have an opinion on it, kind of thing.
Yeah, so in general, I like there to be reasons for trusting testimony, and there can be a number of different ways in which those come. So I don't think it's like a one size fits all sort of thing. So I don't take the position that testimony provides a basic source of justification, but I don't think that it also like has to jump over super high hurdles, right? I think there's pretty commonsensical ways to sort out when testimony is more valuable. A great example of this is going to be like multiple attestation, right? I think this is just going to be born out of the fact that we know that, sort of generally speaking, two sources are not like independently going to make up the same thing, right? So if you get two or more sources all reporting the same thing to you, that increases the likelihood that they're telling the truth. I already had mentioned, for example, the issue of a source having a good track record, right? I think if a source shows themselves to be consistently trustworthy, that provides you with some inductive evidence that they will be telling the truth in this case as well. Furthermore, if you have good reasons to think that the source is not lying and that the source can't be honestly mistaken about the sorts of things that it is reporting. So I think these are pretty common sense principles. But generally, yeah, I don't want to say that just the bare fact that there is testimony justifies you in the belief. I'd want to say the fact that the testimony is is not necessarily corroborated, though that could be a sign of it, but that it's accompanied at any rate by marks of trustworthiness and factors that tell against its falsehood. Does that make sense?
Yep. I totally get where you're coming from and stuff like that. So yeah, I happen to be I changed my mind. I used to be a reductionist, but I think I've become a non-reductionist. But like you said, there are certain inherent defeaters when it comes to the testimony of miracles in particular. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. I want to ask you one last follow-up that's not on the list, but it's my own ideas. So if I sound crazy, let me know. But so in terms of criteria for identifying miracles, I kind of look at upon miracles as sort of like special events of divine design for some religious purpose or whatever purpose of God. And so I like to employ specified complexity, Bill Dembski's intelligent design criteria, and apply that to the context of identifying miracles. I'm just curious, do you think there would be any validity there, or do you just think I'm nuts or something like that?
That sounds sort of similar to, and this might be just like a more sophisticated attempt at cashing this out, but this sounds similar to what I and obviously famously William Lane Craig and many other philosophers have pointed out, that distinguishing like a event that we can't otherwise explain, distinguishing it as a miracle rather than an anomaly, sort of based on the context of the event, right? So if, just somebody comes back from the dead out of the blue, that's kind of inherently mysterious, ambiguous. Do we really know what to make of that? On the other hand, if, say, Jesus predicts that he's going to come back to life as the sort of divine vindication of his claims, I think that that gives us context in which to interpret sort of the resurrection. Now it's confirming something. It's not just something that comes out of the blue. Do you see what you're saying as being sort of a more sophisticated attempt to sort of build on that general idea?
A little bit, yeah. I think basically you've got the religious context is clearly the specification kind of thing where that comes from. And then there's the complexity. Like, how do we argue that an event is complex or extraordinary from a, I guess, lack of a better word, naturalistic perspective and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's exactly right. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, in that case, I do think that that's important. I never thought of it in terms of specified complexity.
Awesome. All right, cool. So, getting back to the list, there is another tool, especially when we're evaluating miracles. And this is going to be key when we come to looking at David Hume's arguments, because a lot of some Christians, Lydia McGrew and Tim McGrew, for example, when it comes to a miracle like the resurrection, they'll employ Bayes' theorem. And I'm just kind of curious. I know some scholars are kind of poo-poo using that, and so get away from this math stuff. You don't need this stuff. So, where do you come down on something like Bayes' theorem? Do you think that's a good tool to use or not?
Yeah, so I myself am not like a super nerd about like Bayes' theorem the way that say the McGrews are. I'm sure like Than Christophilus would be. And that's not because I think there's anything flawed about Bayes' theorem. It's just I get really bored with like all the math and the symbolic logic and things like that. It just doesn't interest me. Probably someday I should polish up my philosophy by brushing up on it. But insofar as I understand it, this is largely an attempt to just sort of formalize our sort of background beliefs or our background information, background knowledge, and sort of use that to help us assess the evidence that we have to come to a probabilistic conclusion about sort of what we should believe in any given case. So I don't have a problem with doing that. I tend to think more in terms of like deductive, inductive, and abductive inferences for things to see if a conclusion is warranted sort of by the facts that are being used to support it. And so I think that Bayes' theorem, from what I understand, can be used in tandem sort of with those sorts of methods. It's just sort of an attempt to refine them. So I don't have a problem with using it. Who is it going to be helpful to? Because again, a lot of people I think are like me when they come across all this math on the page, right? These equations, their eyes just kind of glaze over and they're like, So with some audiences, I don't know that it's necessarily going to land. Now, there are others, right? I think our mutual friend, Ben Watkins, for example, he really likes this kind of Bayesian stuff. So with him, maybe it'd be more effective if you can lay it out, sort of the reasoning in a Bayesian formula. So for me, it's like, I don't want to say it's not a useful tool. I would say it more like depends on who you are dealing with, because I think it's more or less just an attempt to formalize the sort of stuff that probably can be expressed informally. And so how you want to present that, just sort of tailor it to your audience, more or less.
Yeah, I totally agree. Look, it's a tool. So, some tools are appropriate for certain kinds of individuals, like Than Christopoulos, but, they're not needed by others. So, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. So, all right. Well, let's kind of switch gears to talk about from a Christian perspective, the boogeyman, the atheist boogeyman, David Hume. And specifically, he kind of is famous for giving skeptics this catch-all defeater based on the prior probability or based on the plausibility of a miracle occurring in the first place and that sort of thing. So a lot of modern skeptics will appeal to David Hume when they're considering a miracle and say, well, it's just automatically irrational on that basis. So I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on David Hume's reasoning in general when it's used this way?
Yeah, well, as I'm sure we'll discuss, sort of the interpretation of Hume's argument is itself the matter of considerable controversy, especially recently. So what I'll present here is what I think is the correct interpretation of David Hume's argument, what's sort of been called the traditional interpretation of Hume. But people should be aware that not all skeptics, especially in the contemporary era, are going to agree that what I'm about to describe is an accurate characterization of Hume's argument. And so other arguments against miracles from other philosophers, even if they're not true to Hume, unfortunately, I think a lot of Christian apologists think that like they can like show that these sorts of arguments from people like J.H. Sobel or J.L. Mackie or people, Robert Vogelin, that those aren't true to Hume, then therefore they're refuted. And I say no, that's wrong. Even if these are not true to Hume, they're still philosophical arguments in their own right that deserve to be answered. And quite frequently, as we'll see, I think that they commit a lot of the same problems as Hume's argument. But I just say that to preface that. I say that for people who are maybe a little more familiar with this debate, so that they don't think that I'm just assuming that the traditional interpretation of Hume is all there is. I get that there's a lot more to say about this. But bracketing that for the time being and just saying, let's go with the traditional interpretation of Hume's argument, as I see it, Hume begins by defining what he means by a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. And so what this generates is what's called a balance of probabilities argument, where essentially you have to choose between the laws of nature and a miracle. And so you kind of got this weighing of the evidence for the laws of nature versus the evidence for miracles, right? And kind of which one wins. Hume suggests that even in a best case scenario, where you have like the best possible case for a miracle on the basis of testimony, then he has what you call, or what he calls, a proof against a proof, and that the stronger proof has to win. And so what Hume suggests, being a good empiricist like he is, he suggests that our knowledge comes from experience, and that our consistent experience of a miracle, or rather our consistent experience of the laws of nature, is just going to override the best case scenario for a miracle. And so essentially that's why you can never be justified in believing in a miracle on the basis of testimony, because the evidence for the laws of nature is just always going to be stronger. Now, how do I respond to that? Well, I think that our hint that something has gone wrong here as believers in miracles should be that we kind of want to believe in both, right? Like, I want to believe in laws of nature, and I also want to believe in miracles. So why am I being asked to choose between the two? It seems like something has gone wrong here. And so what I would suggest that the problem lies is in Hume's very definition of a miracle, where he has defined it as a violation of the laws of nature. That is what sets up the competition between laws of nature and miracles. But I want to reject it, right? I want to make it so that there is no competition between the two, because I want to accept both miracles and the laws of nature. So I say that the best move is to, at least initially, depending on how a skeptic wants the dialectic to go, but initially I begin by challenging the sort of viability of that definition of miracles. And so the strategy that I employ draws from a philosopher by the name of Robert Larmer. He suggests that it just makes no sense to talk about violations of laws of nature. Like, this is an unintelligible definition, because on no major construal of what laws of nature are does it even actually make sense to say that they've been violated. So some people get on me and say that, oh, well, this is just a semantic point. This is, I'm being pedantic. But I think this is actually important because, again, Hume needs a definition of miracles that is going to place them in conflict with the laws of nature, so that you have to choose between the two. So I put it back on the skeptic. All right, give me a definition of a miracle then that was, one, intelligible, and that, two, is going to actually put the two in competition with one another. Because if we go with David Hume and take laws of nature to just be descriptions of natural regularities, well, an event that occurs that is merely not described by those regularities is not a violation of them, right? And Robert Larmer gives an interesting example of this, right? It's a natural regularity, for example, that virgins do not give birth, right? But now suppose that a doctor performs a medical procedure where he inserts a fertilized egg into a woman's uterus, and the woman is a virgin, and then 9 months later, she gives birth. Well, now we have something that's not described by that natural regularity, right? That virgins do not give birth. Yet I don't think we want to say that any law of nature has been violated. Instead, what we have is an event that is merely not described by those those descriptions of natural regularities. So laws of nature are silent with respect to miracles, but miracles, on my view, are not violating the laws of nature. And so that's kind of how I conceive of things. And that's my general strategy to responding to Hume's argument as I think he intended it.
Yeah, I think I really liked in your video from a couple of years back, because this is something how I argued back way back when I was debating on skeptics and seekers. Look, there are different understandings of what the laws of nature are in the first place, right? So there's this David Hume is kind of assuming this world Newtonian or a anomic necessity type theory, where the laws of nature are almost these prescriptive things that impose their will on the universe. But that's really an outdated notion of what the laws are, right? They're really, mathematical descriptions of regularities in nature, what regularly happens in the natural world. Or some people take the causal dispositions view and stuff. I'm just sort of curious. Like, I take it you yourself would kind of lean towards a descriptive view, or do you go for a causal view? Like, what's your view of the laws of nature?
Yeah, I take them to be descriptive regularities, but this is not like the ontology of the laws of nature is not something that I have like super well defined views on, because I don't care that much. When it comes to Hume's argument for miracles, doesn't matter. Like, whichever one you want to adopt, take any mainstream theory of laws of laws of nature, and it'll just make no sense to speak of them being violated. So I myself do lean towards descriptive regularities, but you don't have to adopt that view in any way to make this point against Hume's argument.
Gotcha. Good point. And also it's important to note that like David Hume himself recognizes this, because outside of his argument, in one of his papers, he also mentions that, hey, I'm happy to believe in a resurrection. I think Queen Elizabeth is his example, but on the basis of experiential evidence. So, I think there's some question. What did even Hume mean that they were absolute violations of the laws of nature? I'm not sure that definition even works for Hume, because outside of testimonial evidence, he is prepared to accept resurrections and stuff like that.
And there's a legitimate question here regarding whose experience are we exactly to be including, right, in our sort of assessment of the probability of the laws of nature. I think the only one that Hume can appeal to without begging the question is his own personal experience. All you can say is that I have not experienced a miracle, therefore, I have this proof, right, of the laws of nature. I have this proof, right, that these sorts of things don't happen. If you start, and again, I know we're going to get to Ben Watkins later, so that's why I keep bringing him up. But in his stuff on miracles, he will frequently actually like slide from saying my, experience to our experience. And the problem with that is once you start extending this to, all human beings, you have a big problem, namely that a considerable number of human beings claim to have experiences of miracles, right? So if we're extending it out to them, then either we have to agree that our background information does include miracles, or we have to judge that all these people are wrong in their assessments that they've experienced a miracle, in which case we're just begging the question, right? So I think the only way to make this out without begging the question is to restrict it to your own personal experience. And that's a very limited base, from which to start making these grand sort of inferences. So there is a little bit of tension in that bit of Hume's argument.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I mean he has sort of his look. He's a product of his time, but he considers any testimony for miracles outside. He just dismisses those because, well, hey, those are claims made by ignorant. How does he phrase it? Ignorant and savage.
Ignorant and barbarous, I believe.
Okay. Barbarous races and stuff like that. He also seems to think. Now he seems to think that contradicting miracle claims. So, like, because the Hindus claim miracles and Christians and Muslims and stuff like that, those are also a reason that cancel out. I'm just kind of curious, like, do you think the fact that they're competing, or perhaps even let's acknowledge there are some counterfeit miracle claims, does that do anything to take away the rationality of believing in miracles?
Yeah, so I've never understood this particular move from skeptics, where it's like, because I get asked all the time, right? Well, do you believe all these other miracle stories? And generally, my answer is no. And the reason why is because I think the evidence in the case of something like the resurrection of Jesus is simply of a different quality than miracle claims in most other religions. So it's like it's this weird sort of all or nothing fallacy, where like if you accept one miracle claim, then like all of a sudden the floodgates are open and you just have to accept all of them. It's really as weird as saying like if you hold one belief, then the floodgates open and you like can't reject any belief. I hold some beliefs and reject others on the basis of the evidence for those propositions. The exact same reasoning applies to miracles. I will accept the ones that are supported by the evidence, and I'll reject the ones that aren't. So that's kind of one issue there. Now, I do think that there's something to be said about, do they cancel each other out? Am I committed to rejecting all miracles in other religious traditions? I would say the short answer is no, right? Because I think the only ones I would have to reject would be miracles that are corroborative of doctrines that are incompatible with Christianity. It'd be a legitimate problem, right, if we had equally good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus as we did for, like, say, Muhammad splitting the moon or something like that, right? Because now these are apparently, corroborative of Christianity and Islam. They're corroborating doctrines of both religions, and those doctrines are in conflict with each other, right? So there we would have a real issue. On the other hand, let's say you've got a Muslim family, right, who's got a child that is like deathly ill or whatever, and that child seemingly like undergoes a miraculous healing. I don't have to reject that as a Christian at all. I don't have to say that God cannot do miracles within other religious contexts. They just aren't allowed to, they can't be confirming the doctrines of the religions that would contradict Christianity or that would conflict with Christianity. If we had a case of that, then I agree there would be a real problem. But in no case do I have to reject every possible miracle that's claimed to have happened in every other religion, as long as it's not corroborative of doctrine. So those are kind of my two lines of response to that idea from Hume.
Awesome. So I should have asked this earlier when we were talking about the laws of nature, but I do want to just ask. So there is an objection that I've actually heard from a couple of skeptics, where they'll say, well, look, some laws of nature may be, may be able to be quote unquote violated, or some, it's permitted for there to be exceptions, stuff like that. But there are other laws of nature, like the second law of thermodynamics, which are they will say are absolute. Look, even Aaron Wall, for example, has proven that even on the quantum level, the second law of thermodynamics still applies, and therefore it applies to a multiverse scenario. And I've heard a skeptic try to say that the second law of thermodynamics is physically necessary. So in any world where a physical universe exists, this must be true, and it's absolute. There can be no exceptions to it. So, like, what would you say against a skeptic who's saying, well, we have these absolute, the second law of thermodynamics, for example?
Yeah, and this is, I think, a general challenge to so what I laid out before was sort of Larmor's analysis of how you can have miracles occur without there being any violations of the laws of nature. And so a challenge has been that sort of a miracle is at least going to have to involve the creation of new energy, right? And isn't it like one of the most fundamental laws of the science of thermodynamics that energy isn't created or destroyed, right? So it seems like at least this law is going to be violated. And, this is an objection that, people like David Corner and Evan Fales have put forward. So I do think that, yeah, this is a good question to consider. The problem is that the first law of thermodynamics, right? It's not actually an absolute law, and we know this from general relativity, right? Robin Collins has a whole paper out there arguing on this. I believe I believe the name of it, if I'm remembering correctly, is The Energy of the Soul. He's discussing it specifically in the context of dualism, but generally he argues that general relativity presents a major problem for the energy conservation objection. And basically the problem is that there's no local concept of stress energy that can be defined for the gravitational field in general relativity. He goes on to point out that this is exploited in basically Big Bang cosmology. The universe expands, right? Waves of each photon are stretched, and so the wavelengths of the photons become longer and longer. Basically, that's the phenomenon of the red shift. But the energy of the photon, right, it's inversely proportional to its wavelength. So photons with longer wavelengths have less energy. So the vast majority of the photons in the universe, right, those in the cosmic microwave background, they're not absorbed by matter. And the total number of these remains pretty much constant, but they're all losing energy. So we just know that on the cosmic scale, energy conservation is false. The other thing to point out is that, strictly speaking, the first law of thermodynamics, it only holds within closed systems, right? But to try to argue that the universe is a closed system, not open to the intervention of God, is effectively to beg the question against theism. So, like, once we've properly defined the law as only holding within closed systems, there's no non-question begging way to press it against the activity of God.
Perfect. Yeah. Sorry, I said second law. I meant first and second law of thermodynamics there. So yeah. All right.
They're related. They're very closely related.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. All right. So one last follow up here on Hume, because you mentioned that there are alternative interpretations of Hume. Not everybody agrees with you about the traditional interpretation. So did you just want to take some time to what are some of the other ways people interpret Hume's argument then, and why do you reject them, I guess?
Yeah, well, there are a whole lot of them, right? And I go through them pretty much, pretty well in detail in my 2-hour video on this. But so generally, like on the traditional interpretation, we would take part 1 of the essay and part 2 of the essay of miracles to be 2 separate arguments. So the first part, we would generally say he's making an a priori argument that, like, in principle, there's no way you could be justified in believing in a miracle. Then part 2, it's like laying that aside, like laying aside the argument of part 1. When you just look at the evidence that we actually have, like, it obviously can't suffice to sustain belief in miracles anyway. So the traditional interpretation, my interpretation, takes these as 2 separate arguments. Now, the key strategy, people like Mackey, people like Vogelin, people like Sobel, they want to say, no, that's wrong. These are 2 parts of the same argument. So that has been a prominent feature in these arguments. Now, there's a few different ways of sort of cashing that out, right? And so the results, in some cases, commit a lot of the same mistakes that I think Hume does. I think that this is evident in, like, J.L. Mackey and Alexander George and people like that. And I think that sometimes we just get trivial conclusions. So, like Robert Vogelin's book, A Defense of Hume on Miracles, he ends up giving Hume this really trivial conclusion, right? That, like, the evidence for a miracle just has to be more probable than, or the probability that the testimony is true has to be greater than the probability that the testimony is false. Well, like, who's disputing that? I mean, it's such a trivial conclusion. And of course, one argument against it, right, would be Hume's own rhetoric. He's saying that, like, it's this general maxim worthy of our interpretation, right? Or worthy of our attention, that, like, no testimony has ever been produced that's sufficient to, command belief in miracles. He says this is everlasting check, right? That'll, at least with, like, the wise and learned, it will be there as long as the world endures. So Hume has, like, this really strong rhetoric that would seem like he can't be making these claims if Vogelin is right in his interpretation of Hume. So generally, yes, there are a lot of various interpretations of Hume. I think that as arguments, they either fail on their own merits, or like Vogelin's, they just come up with these like trivial truisms, which for purely exegetical reasons, I don't think are true to Hume. But whether they're true to Hume or not, they're not controversial. Like, as a miracle proponent, I don't have any problem adopting the idea that the testimony for a miracle, or for a testimony for the testimony's truth has to be more probable than the testimony's falsehood. Like, almost no one would disagree with that.
Awesome. All right, cool. So I kind of want to move forward a bit in terms of application. So on this prior probability issue, I know a lot of modern atheists and skeptics love to utilize David Hume's type reasoning, and they'll say, well, look, just based on a frequentist or statistical basis alone, the prior probability for any miracle, and in a Christian context, this usually comes up on debates about the resurrection, but they'll say, well, look, out of how many billions and billions of occurrences, such as a human dying, has there ever been a miracle, like such as someone rising from the dead? Well, it's like one chance out of 10 billion. And they'll say on this basis, it's extremely low probability that such an event could ever occur. Now, I think that the main issue here is like these skeptics are getting the wrong reference class. They're bringing in background evidence that's irrelevant to the truth or falsity of the hypothesis, and therefore they're making a mistake here, kind of thing. So I'm just kind of curious to get from you, generally speaking, for any miracle claim, how do we determine what the proper reference class is? How do we find out what background evidence is actually relevant to the truth or falsity for any given miracle hypothesis? Because that's a crucial question to get right.
Yeah, and I don't think that I want to say that, our experience of a, universe that operates in regularly predictable ways, I don't want to say that I think that that's irrelevant, but I do want to say that that's not determinative on its own, right? Because a miracle, it kind of needs that in order to stand out, right? Tim McGrew likes to give the example of, like black writing on a black background. It's completely unhelpful, right? It doesn't stand out. You need it to be written on like a lighter background so that you can see the message. And so something similar, I think, is true with miracles. We need sort of that backdrop of the general regularity of nature in order to determine that an event stands out, right? Remember, I defined it as a naturally impossible event. So in order to determine that it's naturally impossible, we need to be able to have a good idea of what is naturally possible. So I'm good with that, right? Saying that that's relevant background information. The problem, I think, is when they're saying that that's the only thing that's relevant to our probability, right? Is counting how many times this sort of event has happened. Because I think that that's essentially a frequentist interpretation of probability, where you say, Bart Ehrman is kind of the worst about this. It's like, if I want to determine that this event happens, then I just count how many times did this happen in the past. And you raise a good objection, which is what one of the classical problems against this is known as the reference class problem. So basically, the idea here is what sort of like background information am I taking, by which to sort of measure the thing against, right? Like, let's say that I'm interested in like, what is the probability that I'm going to live to 80 years old, right? Well, I could choose the reference class of, white guys, right? What is the probability that a white person is going to make it to 80? Or maybe males, right? Maybe what's the probability that a male is going to live to 80? What about the fact that I wear glasses, right? What's the probability that a person who wears glasses is going to make it to 80? What about, my Christian faith? What is the probability that a Christian is going to make it to 80? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any non-arbitrary way to make the selection of the proper reference class by which to determine that. So it seems like you can't determine probability solely based on frequency. Another issue with this, and this I think is a general issue for a lot of Humean type arguments that like explicitly depend on frequency. It's how do you stop this sort of reasoning from ruling out, miracles to ruling out rational belief in literally any event that is rare, right? Like that people who, for example, have like Rh null blood type, right? It's extremely, extremely rare. Like almost nobody has this blood type. Well, if we're calculating things based on their frequency, it seems like we can never, ever be justified in believing that. So to sum up, I do want to say, I think that the regularity in nature, our past experience of that, that's relevant, to assessing a miracle, but it is not determinative. It might mean that, well, maybe we're going to require additional or particularly strong evidence to believe in a miracle, because maybe that gives me a low prior or something. But I don't think it gives us anything approximating, what we would need to say that testimony can never get us over the edge there. And a good example of this comes from the philosopher John Earman, right? He talks about, I believe it's this phenomenon of proton decay, right? Something that we've never actually observed. We don't know if proton decay is actually something that happens. But, we have tests set up, right? We have sensors that are set up to detect proton decay. So if the news came out tomorrow, right, even though, heretofore we've never experienced it, if we, saw that qualified scientists were saying like, no, we finally have detected proton decay, I don't see why I shouldn't be allowed to believe that based solely on their testimony. The fact that I've never experienced that before, it just, I don't see why that should override the testimony of the scientist. And so similarly, if we have sufficiently strong evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I don't see why we shouldn't be able, and I should say sufficiently strong testimonial evidence. I don't know why that shouldn't be able to override sort of whatever inductive presumption our past experience has against it. And one last thing on this, you mentioned prior probability. As long as the prior probability of an event is not zero, right? Any non-zero prior probability can, in principle, be overcome by sufficient evidence. And I've never heard a good explanation for why that evidence shouldn't be able to come in the way of testimony. And by the way, the only way to get a zero probability is for the thing to be a logical contradiction or like straightforwardly unintelligible. And I don't think anyone thinks that is true of the resurrection of Jesus. I just say that because some people who don't understand how reasoning works, Tom Jump, for example, say that the probability of something is zero if we've never experienced it before. Like he apparently thinks that you determine the prior probability based on how many times you've experienced the thing. And like, sorry, that's not how you get a zero prior probability. It has to be a logical contradiction or like nonsense in order to have a zero prior probability.
Wow, I didn't know Tom made that argument. That is pretty bad there. So, all right, awesome. So, one thing, yeah, I just want to say, I misspoke. You're right that these kind of frequentist things are relevant. They're not irrelevant, but I guess I would say they're necessary components of the background evidence. They're not sufficient in their own right to raise or lower the prior probability on a, to prove the truth or falsity of the hypothesis on a balance there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what about, so in terms of application then, there are other types of arguments that are said to lower the prior probability. So here's one that I got from Nathan Ormond and James Fedor when I was on their channel. And believe it or not, even Dr. Lydia McGrew behind the scenes has told me she thinks this may be something that is a good argument to lower the prior probability. So I'm just kind of curious on your take on it. But she'll say, so for any particular miracle, right, the prior probability that Jesus rose from the dead, or whatever particular miracle you're specifying, given that God exists and he's omnipotent and can perform a potentially infinite amount of other miracles or something like that, they'll say the prior probability for that particular miracle is low, given he could have performed any other type of miracle in its place and stuff like that. And they'll claim, well, that lowers the prior probability for any miracle hypothesis. And I disagree with this, but I'm kind of curious what your take on something like that would be.
Yeah, I think it would probably be fair to say that I could accept that this is like the weakest possible sort of inductive evidence against a miracle, right? In the same way that for like literally any other hitherto unprecedented event, the absence of it and the possibility that it could have been some other event, that is like the broadest sort of inductive evidence against it. But the thing is that like really broad inductive cases like that, they're super easy to overcome. So it's not all that strong. And especially so when we're talking about the actions of agents, I think. I think like frequency and things like this become a lot more relevant when we're talking about something that happens sort of in the natural course of events, when this is supposed to be being brought about by sort of like normal processes that sort of are determined to some degree by their frequency. So if we're taking out intentional agency, I think frequency becomes a lot more relevant. But if we are talking about the actions of an agent, which certainly God would be, then it's a lot less relevant how often this has happened. And we can give easy examples of this, right? I've only ever proposed to a woman once in my life, right? And I'd never done that before. So is that some inductive evidence against, the idea that I did it? Sure, but it's very easy to overcome that with, the tons of testimonial evidence from pictures, evidence from the fact that I married, right? All of these are still like just overwhelming evidence that this did in fact happen, despite the fact that, it had never happened before. So I think when we're talking about the actions of agents, these sorts of broad inductive considerations count even less than they normally do.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, so last question on the prior probability, because we've been focusing on this a lot. But I think this is a key issue when it comes to assessing the rationality and stuff. So, actually, a couple more questions. So, the first one I want to get from you is, okay, we've been looking at potential factors or background evidence that may lower the prior probability, but often neglected by atheists and skeptics is, well, what about background evidence that can actually raise the prior probability of a miracle or something like that? Do you have anything to say on that front? Do you think there can be occasions where there is good background evidence that actually makes the miracle more probable than not to be true?
I think there's a way to do that, right? I think, for example, if you take a classical apologetic approach, right, where you want to establish something like the existence of God before you move right to the say case for the resurrection or something like that, then I think that is background information that is relevant to the resurrection, right? Because if we already know that, a being with the requisite causal powers to raise Jesus from the dead exists, then it's a lot easier to sort of accept that being did that than if we have to accept, both that the being exists and that they did that all in the same step. Now, I don't think you have to do it that way, right? I like to present the argument from the resurrection as a standalone argument for theism. I think you can do that. I don't think it's at all required that you would establish the existence of God first, but that's absolutely a route you can go. People like Richard Swinburne will go even further and argue that, he thinks that there are good a priori reasons to think that, a God would do something like this. I myself am not sure how persuasive I find those arguments. Some of them look a little bit to me like, painting a target around the hit, but I don't claim to have thought through those necessarily as carefully as I should have. So I don't have a firm opinion on those. So there are definitely, in principle, ways you could do that. Those aren't my preferred way of arguing for, the main miracle that I do argue for, which is the resurrection of Christ. But I don't see anything wrong with doing that.
Awesome. Okay. Now, this is a follow-up. Last thing, and it wasn't on the list, but I realized this is a really important one for the layman in the audience, because we've been talking a lot about technical stuff, right? The probability calculus of Bayes' theorem, prior probabilities and the evidence. But I want to ask now, look, centuries before the common man living in Athens when Paul came and preached, he knew nothing about Bayes' theorem or prior probabilities. So I'm kind of wondering, do you think it's possible to still be rational, believing in a miracle on the basis of the evidence, the direct evidence for it, right? You think the evidence is stronger that it happened, and just sort of ignoring or bracketing out prior probability factors? Do we have to take into account prior probability to be rational, or can you be rational without even considering it?
I don't think you have to explicitly consider it. I'd probably be a little reluctant to say that you could be rational without giving it any sort of weight, but I don't know that you have to be doing this in like any sort of formal or Bayesian way. I think that we kind of have an intuitive grasp of these sorts of things. I think that, the average person kind of gets that we would want better than average evidence for a miracle. And I think the reason why that is because they're tacitly acknowledging the relevance of their background information. They're tacitly grasping that that provides some degree of inductive evidence against a miracle, which would make you want a little bit better than average evidence for a miracle. So I don't think that you need to like consciously, formally have this like all worked out into a Bayesian formula in your own mind to be rational. And so I think that's sort of our folk rationality, right? I think there's something to be said for it being honed by, reflection on these sorts of matters. But in general, no, I don't think you have to have mastered Bayes' theorem in order to be rational in believing in the resurrection. Indeed, I would argue that Bayesian arguments for the resurrection are probably turning on those more familiar, informal sorts of inferences that are a little more familiar to us. And it's just sort of ratcheting up the sophistication on the presentation.
Gotcha. Yep. Yeah, it makes sense. I think, yeah, most people, it is this intuitive, implicit kind of thing that they're doing in their heads rather than making it explicit. So, yeah, that makes sense. So, all right. Okay. So let's say, guess what, David, you did a great job. You've convinced me a miracle has occurred, whatever the miracle is. I got healed from, I was an amputee. Now I have my arm or something like that. I'm kind of curious. What do you think are the various kinds of religious, or theological or otherwise, the significance of proving miracles? Can it be used in different ways? Are there different types of miracles and stuff like that? So, what are the significance of miracles in your view?
Yeah, there's probably no one right answer to that. Obviously, the one I primarily focus on, right, is the sort of apologetic value of them in the case of, arguing for the existence of God or the truth of a particular religion. But yeah, I don't want to ignore that I think there can be a faith boosting aspect to these too, right? Where personal, believers in God can experience healing, right? As a form of, for example, deepening their own relationship with God. Now, this is not territory that I've thought about quite as much, but I do think it's a really important one. And so I think it's helpful that you bring it up because there are absolutely benefits or practical utility to this beyond just Christian apologetics.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So, all right. So, we're not going to spend a long time on this one because I think you've already kind of answered what were some alternative interpretations of David Hume's type reasoning and more contemporary uses. But someone who I've actually done a couple of shows with, along with David Russell, is Ben Watkins, the atheist there. And just kind of quickly, you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but are you familiar with Ben Watkins' argumentation, and what are your thoughts on his take there?
Yeah, Ben is an interesting guy. At least we used to be friends before. I don't know if he still considers me one since he decided to turn into a radical leftist who hates everyone who has opinions slightly more conservative than his. But at least back in the day when we were friends, we went back and forth on this. We had a live conversation about it. And he's a little bit hard to interpret because I think he's trying to take hodgepodges of he's trying to take bits of Robert Fogelin and bits of J.H. Savelle and bits of Alexander George. And he's trying to serve up this whole gumbo of it. And I honestly have a hard time of figuring out because I can pinpoint what those authors are trying to say, but it seems to me that they're saying very different things. I don't know if Ben thinks they're all saying the same thing, or if he thinks that he's just like taking parts of it together. So with Ben, I kind of take like a take it in pieces kind of approach. What is he saying here? Why do I think that that's wrong? So he, for example, in his interview with Justin Schieber on Real Atheology, he, for example, said that he thought that Hume's definition of miracles is the violations of laws of nature. He thinks that that's like a really cogent definition. I've explained why I don't think it is. Now, in personal interaction with me, he's kind of said, oh, I don't think that that definition is actually important. But in practice, he does seem to think it's important that laws of nature be in conflict with miracles in some way. So, like, if you don't want to define them as violations of the laws of nature, fine. But then, like, what is your analysis upon which the two are in conflict with one another? I don't think he claims to be a frequentist, but a lot of Ben's statements on this, I have a really hard time interpreting them apart from the view that he takes a frequentist interpretation of probability. So my thoughts with Ben on this are it's not always clear, like, what exact position he's in based on the people that he's quoting. It seems like there's a whole bunch of like different camps into which he could fall. And if he's trying to synthesize them together, again, with all due respect to Ben, I'm not sure what that synthesis is supposed to look like, all, brought together. But there are definitely individual aspects of it, such as what I see as being his dependence on frequentism, his incoherent definition of miracles, things like that, that I can individually pick at. So those are some of my assorted thoughts on Ben's approach to this issue.
All right, awesome. So yeah, I think in terms of my list of questions, that's it that I had here. I was trying to keep it to an hour out of respect for your time, but before we go to audience questions and that sort of thing, do you, and for the audience, if you guys have questions, now's your chance. Just make sure to write them in the chat. I've been starring them as we've been going down there. And yep, David, you've got a lot from a bunch of people we know. But just before we get to the audience questions, I want to turn it to you. You're my guest here. Let me ask you, in terms of the rationality of miracles, is there any topics or any issues that I haven't asked you about that you think is crucial to understanding this issue?
Well, I think that we did slightly touch on it. I think that the context, though, of the miracle is really worth hammering home. And again, because we did touch on it before, I don't want to hammer it too hard. But I think there is this very interesting question of distinguishing miracles from anomalies, right? This is kind of almost a forgotten point in the contemporary debate over Hume. But last century, a prominent atheist philosopher by the name of Antony Flew actually made this a cornerstone of his objection to miracles, was sort of how do we distinguish miracles from natural anomalies? And I think that the correct answer there is the context of the miracle, right? This is how it is that we can, again, see that a random person coming back from the dead is kind of like ambiguous, whereas the resurrection of Jesus, because of the context in which it occurs, confirms, or at least can be seen as evidence to confirm the truth of the message that he offers. I think that this is an important insight. I really wish it was discussed and developed by more contemporary philosophers. Unfortunately, the conversation just kind of seems to have moved on because contemporary defenders of Hume are sort of just bringing up other issues that are worth talking about. But yes, I think that is a fun topic in and of itself. So yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to bring that up again.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So going to our audience questions. Okay. So I'm going to start with our good buddy, Juan from Modern Atheism. He has a few questions, but starting with this one. So he says, David, if one scientist says that he observed proton decay, do you think that his fellow scientists will take his word for it or demand to see the data?
Probably his fellow scientists will want to see the data for it. But the scenario I was sketching before with proton decay was one in which it's something that you have not personally experienced, so it's outside of your experience. And so could be one scientist, provided we don't, like, if you have countervening voices, right? If you have other scientists saying, like, no, we haven't actually observed that, then I think that provides an undercutting defeater for the testimony. But if you've just got a scientist saying that, right, that's all the information you have, I do think that is evidence for the existence of proton decay. And of course, it becomes stronger if you have multiple scientists saying, like, yeah, we also saw that, we saw the data, X, Y, Z. The point was just, I don't think I have to personally experience proton decay to believe the testimony of a scientist or scientists who claim to have observed it, and that I could be rational in believing in a hitherto unprecedented event on the basis solely of testimony.
Gotcha. Oh, okay. There we go. All right. And this one comes from Ringo Cat. He's in the audience here. So, hey, Ringo. He says, in his own town, an occult shop tried to open across the street from his home, selling crystal junk and books, etc. And he prayed to God against that. He's a Christian and stuff like that. And guess what? The guy never opened this shop. So the Lord shut him down. And he sees this as a miracle. I'm just kind of wondering, like, yeah, what's your take on miracles like that?
Yeah, so I would say that maybe you could see that as being an act of providence or something like that. It doesn't meet the criteria that I set forward for a miracle, because I specified that it had to be a naturally impossible event. And obviously, somebody not being able to open a store, that's obviously not a naturally impossible event. So I could potentially categorize that as divine providence, answer to prayer, something like that. But it doesn't quite meet what I mean by a miracle, because I've stipulated sort of tighter boundaries on what it is for something to be a miracle.
Gotcha. All right. Awesome. All right. And now going back to Juan, I'm going to be alternating because Juan's got at least 3 rounds here. So he says, David, let's say we have 4 men giving their testimony that they saw a flying man. Let's say that they are willing to endure persecution over this claim. Would you believe that there was a flying man?
Yeah, so this is well, at least in the YouTube sphere, a kind of common thought experiment that originates, as far as I know, with Doug from Pine Creek. Mm-hmm. Here's the issue with it. I think it's underspecified. Let me make it real easy. If you're going to say that the quality of these 4 testimonies is, equivalent to the quality of what we have in the 4 Gospels, would I believe it? Yes, obviously. I think that the quality of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus in the 4 Gospels is sufficient to warrant that. So if this is supposed to be like a stalking horse hypothesis that just parodies that, then, yes, trivially it follows that I think it would be rational. Now, the problem here is that it's not specified in the thought experiment as put here as to, do we just have the bare fact that they're saying that they saw this? Or are we getting some details about what these experiences were like, details that would justify us in concluding that they're actually rational in believing that this happened, right? Because you can sincerely believe something for crappy reasons, right? I mean, it happens all the time. So just, claiming that you saw something without giving me any details about what it's like doesn't let me know if you're actually being rational in it. So if you're going to say, in the hypothetical scenario, yes, these sorts of details are present in the testimony that would make it rational, then yes, I would believe 4 witnesses who had, quality testimonies, who gave evidence that they were, not lying. Then yes, of course, I would believe it, would be the answer there.
Awesome. And just so you're aware, your video's frozen, but we can hear you fine and stuff. So there you go.
Is that better?
Nope, you're still frozen.
Interesting. Okay.
Looks like you're about to backhand slap me or something. Like that was a stupid question, Dale. You're dumb. No problem. All right, so it's still frozen, but yeah, it's fine with me as long as you don't care, kind of thing. So as long as we can hear your answers, that's all I care about. But so this one comes from. Are you aware of Tavo Sanabri, David?
Yes. Recently, I became aware of him. I saw you had a conversation with James Fodor over on James Fodor's channel on his RHBS model for the resurrection. I thought he made some interesting arguments against it. I don't know if, I think he gave like 7 or 8 different arguments against it. I don't know if I agreed with all of them, but some of them were definitely interesting. Ones that I wished that I had access to before I made my own video responding to James Fodor, but that's kind of just a consequence of time. By the way, am I still frozen?
Yes, yeah, you are.
Wow, I even switched cameras. All right, well, I don't know what I can do about that. Hopefully it comes back. But yes, he recently reached out to me a day or two ago via Messenger. And so I should apologize. I haven't gotten back to him yet, but I am aware of him vaguely.
Okay. Well, yeah, he's a great guy. You could have a great conversation with him and stuff. And he was a lifelong atheist, and he's starting to come around to. He's definitely a Jesus follower. He believes he rose from the dead and that he's God and stuff, but he's not 100% committed to Christianity yet. So he was asking a question here. So he says, number one, David Pallmann makes great content. I was interested in quantifiably evaluating the religious canon for each major religion, and he looked at 17 different religious traditions and their formative texts. But he only looked at people and places. He only looked at people and places in a survey. So his question for you, David, is this: are people and places adequate for creating a sense of pre-test reliability for each work?
To the extent that I'm interpreting what he's asking there correctly, I think the answer is yes. If we're talking about like the sort of reliability of a text before we do like a deep dive, but it's just like mentioning people and places that actually exist or whatever, then yes, I think that that's going to be relevant information to assessing their reliability. It's obviously not sufficient on its own, but I guess that's not what he's asking. He's saying it's sort of a pre-test of their reliability. So yeah. Sorry if I'm misunderstanding you there, Tavo.
Well, I think, okay, to put it into context of our show here, I think what he's asking here is, okay, great. Let's say we can prove, so, the reportage model that you and Lydia McGrew and Jonathan McClatchy go for it. Okay, great. We can prove that the Bible's accurate, or certain texts are accurate in terms of the people and places. But does that provide a pretest case that they're reliable in making miracle claims or not? And by the way, we can see you moving now. Yeah. But okay. Does proving reliability on like things like people and places, does that give us credence to believe in the reliability of miracle claims in a text?
Yeah, I think, again, it would give you some. It wouldn't be sufficient on its own, but again, he doesn't look like he's asking if it would be sufficient.
Okay. All right, fair enough. All right, back to Juan. So, David, how much testimonial evidence from Hindus claiming to have seen Hindu miracles would it be necessary to overturn your belief in Christianity?
I mean, it would depend. Are these miracles that essentially conflict with like Christian doctrine, or like would be corroborative of Hindu doctrine? Hinduism, and I'm not super familiar with it, but from what I understand, I don't think that they like believe in a supreme like God figure. So I don't even know if it's like a religion that's based on revelation or supposed to have revelations confirmed by miracles. So this potentially could be a bad example, just because I'm not sure how well miracles really sit within Hindu theology in the first place. That could be a result of my own ignorance, though. So, I mean, in general, if you had a miracle that was conflicting with Christianity or conflicting with some essential Christian doctrine, then I would just say more evidence for that miracle than what I think is the best attested miracle in Christianity. Although this might be controversial. I don't know how you feel about it, Dale, but I think the resurrection is the best attested Christian miracle. So yeah, if I had stronger evidence for a contradictory miracle claim, then I think that would be enough to overturn my belief in Christianity.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that I think the resurrection is the best attested. Look, I looked into the miracle claims of other religions, including Hinduism under various versions, and nothing came close. Like there was no evidence that would prove an event happened on a balance of probabilities. I guess the closest thing for me was looking like Islam with the numerical patterns. There was a couple month period where it looked to me like there was evidence on a balance of probabilities that some kind of divine design was responsible for those. But then on my subsequent evaluation, my third and most rigorous evaluation, it ultimately failed. It didn't fulfill the criteria for specified complexity, and therefore was a failure. So, but yeah, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, but like, so you're familiar with Caleb Jackson, right?
Of course, yep.
He thinks that certain modern miracles, like within Christianity, but certain modern miracles, I think he takes the position that like these are better attested than the resurrection. So I was saying some Christians quibble about, particularly some of my Catholic friends will quibble that the resurrection is like the best attested Christian miracle claim. I wasn't sure what your position was on that.
Okay, put it this way. I think it's the best attested religion authenticating miracle, because the Caleb's work, I'm not sure those are religious authenticating miracles. I see them more as miracles of compassion or something like that. So yeah.
Good distinction there.
All right. And that, did I get rid of that? Yeah. Okay. Next up, Jay Feather. So this is talking about a Catholic. I had to admit, I'm not sure about this, but if you've heard of Saint Charbel, apparently he is reported, there's testimony, he did 33,000 miracle healings. So Caleb Jackson probably knows all about this guy, but if you know anything about Saint Charbel and his miracles, do you want to say anything about it?
Yeah, I have to admit that I don't. When it comes to Catholic miracles, my kind of go-to guy would be Kevin Non-Tredicath. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but yeah, he does a lot of videos on Catholic miracles, and I can't say for this miracle in particular, or I guess these thousands of miracles in particular, but generally what I have found, at least from the limited research I've done, mostly just from watching Kevin on this, typically Catholics have a bad habit of like overstating the evidence for the Catholic miracles, has sort of been my impression. But again, that might not be the case with this particular one, because I haven't looked into it.
Fair enough. All right, and we have a couple more from, so Mel Norment asks, I don't know why some event that presumably occurs less often should be improbable absolutely. So it sounds like he or she is agreeing with you. The number of men that have walked on the moon are rare, but it's not improbable that a man can walk on it. So getting to his question then, David, what do you think of the classical definition of faith, where we believe on account of the trustworthiness of God instead of the intrinsic evidence of miracles on facts of revelation?
I'm not sure if that is the classical definition of faith, but I mean, I guess the concern that I would have about this would be, what do you mean by the trustworthiness of God, right? And how would you know that God is trustworthy, right? If you are not basing that belief itself on, say, like evidence of miracles or certain other facts, certain other bits of empirical evidence. So I guess I would just have questions about. It seems like the order of that is wrong to me, and I'm not sure how it's not. I'm not sure how you're going to avoid just basically assuming weighty theological beliefs from the outset.
Just kind of curious to follow up on that, because I noticed you and Juan were kind of discussing on his latest video. He mentions the inner witness of the Holy Spirit as kind of a subjective form of evidence. Are you open to subjective evidence, such as the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, as providing justification or warrant, or does it have to be objective miracle claims of some sort?
Well, here's my position on that. So I do think that the inner witness of the Holy Spirit can provide sort of like confirmation or assurance to the believer, but I don't think that that is epistemically independent of the public case for Christianity. So sort of like I have certain experiences in like worship services or when I pray, so on and so forth, that I interpret as being the presence of God. But that is itself sort of based on this sort of background information that I have, this vast body of evidence supporting the existence of God and the truth of Christianity. If I didn't have that, so if I'm saying we're taking that out of the picture, I don't know that I could base my belief on these sorts of experiences, because it seems kind of easy to explain them just by recourse to, like worship music priming me up for it, or like we know psychologically that praying can, have these sorts of calming effects on people and things like that. So basically, I wouldn't know how to argue that these are veridical experiences apart from the case for Christianity. Now, given that that case is in place, I think that that does lead us to expect that we would experience the presence of God. So given that, I do think we can have additional confirmation via the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. I just don't think that that's epistemically autonomous or independent, if that makes sense.
Interesting. All right. So it looks like I'm going to be joining the ranks of Ben Watkins and hating David Pallmann because I disagree. Just joking. No, I appreciate your view there and stuff. And I think even though I would disagree with you on that, I do think, believe it or not, the Holy Spirit can provide warrant for the even the unbeliever to come to faith in Christ and that sort of thing. But it's important to distinguish. It's based on this, the subjective evidence is a properly basic belief, which relates to knowledge and our qualia of knowledge, right? Kind of thing. It's not just I'm feeling happy because I'm singing a song. So I think you're right that we need to make sure we're not conflating that, or just how I'm feeling good on a certain day. So yeah. Thank you so much. I think that is everything in the chat that I can see. Uh, Okay, what are you good for one more, or do you need to go?
No, I can keep doing this for a little bit, but if you need to go, then obviously we can shut it down. But I'm not in a rush.
Okay, all right. We got one more from Modern 8 from Juan on James Fedor's point. Not all miracles that are logically possible are equally probable. God can put a truck on the moon, but this does not mean that miracles are a priori equally probable than the resurrection.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure what to make of that there. My view would be, I think that kind of the sort of prior probability on God performing a miracle, at least I'm inclined towards the view that it's sort of inscrutable, because we're dealing with the actions of an agent that, if I'm using the miracle to argue for theism, then I'm not like licensed to assume that he exists or to make any claims about, what sort of things he'd be likely to do. So I'm inclined towards the view that it's just inscrutable, the prior probability of what God would do, but that given, a sufficient body of empirical evidence, we can nevertheless make an inference to the best explanation that God has done this miracle.
Yeah. I think I agree. Like he's kind of responding to my point. Remember, I asked you one of the things that some atheists and even Dr. Lydia McGrew have said can lower the prior probability is saying, well, why did he do this particular miracle? Why a resurrection and not miraculous ascension or a miraculous, whatever else, writing his name on the moon or something like that? He could have done any number of miracles. And to Juan's point, I think I would. So Juan and I are planning for Easter weekend. We're going to be doing a switcheroo resurrection debate. So I'm going to be the resurrection skeptic. Juan is going to be the Christian arguing for the resurrection. And just a hint for you, Juan, this is going to be I'm going to raise this point as something that lowers the prior probability of miracles. But I think you're going to win that point because I agree with you that not all miracles are equally probable, kind of thing, right? Given the background evidence, a resurrection is much more likely, especially if you have things like Jesus predicting his death and resurrection, for example, beforehand, compared to God writing his name on the moon or, whatever other miracle you want to say. So, yeah, but of course you're going to need to prove that is actually the case in the debate in order to make that work. But yeah, great point. I agree. All right.
We got one last point here, maybe from modern atheism. It's not exactly a question, but this is going back to the flying man thing. He was saying he thinks normal people would say that we're being too gullible if we believe that a person flew rather on the basis of the testimony of 4 people. And then he says, I'd be biting the bullet if I were to say that I think that that would be fine. What is the bullet that I'm supposed to be biting there? Generally, biting a bullet implies that there's like some counterintuitive or some sort of problematic consequence of saying that. I don't really see what it is if we're not going to assume from the start that a person just can't fly. And we've got sort of four people who are saying that this happened. We've got really good reasons to think that they can't be honestly mistaken about this. We've got really good reasons to think they're not lying, all of which is stuff that, I take to be stipulated in the hypothetical. Then I can't for the life of me think why it would not be rational to believe them. And it seems like the only thing that would be preventing you in that case is this a priori assumption that it just can't happen.
Yeah, I think it's kind of summarized. Like, you can see the incredulity, the fallacy of incredulity here, where he says that a man was flying, David. Again, so it's you're kind of saying, well, I'm totally incredulous to this. No matter what, I can't.
I know. Yeah, it's like if nothing can convince you, fine, but that's just like a psychological report. If we're trying to talk about the rationality of it, is there some reason why it would not be rational? Because, presumably, ordinarily, we would agree that it would be rational to believe 4 independent witnesses when we have excellent reason to think that they're not lying or honestly mistaken. I'm just saying, why is it different when we're asking about a miracle? It seems like the only reason to apply a different standard here is some sort of a priori commitment to the view that miracles just don't happen.
Yeah. He just follows up. Do you think most normal people would believe in them or not then?
It's hard to say, but I also don't base what's rational to believe on what like most people would do. I don't think that most people really think a whole lot about this stuff. People believe, I don't think your average person believes in the resurrection of Jesus, frankly, on the basis of an examination of the historical evidence. Most of them probably believe it because this is what they were taught in their religious tradition. So, if we had a widespread cultural belief that somebody flew, then probably the normal people in that society would believe it. If it's our current society where this is not like a deeply entrenched belief, then I suspect you would probably have a bit more controversy about it. Ultimately, I don't care that much about what a normal person would believe. I care about what is rational to believe.
We do have a good one here from, again, Mal Normant. It seems to him that miracles are only changes in appearances that are rare. How are they objective evidence for God's revelation? I would think that some direct acquaintance with the fact of revelation through God's action is better and certain evidence.
Let me see if I'm understanding him correctly. So he thinks that they're only changes in appearance. Well, we can agree that they're rare. I'm not sure what he means by a change in appearance. So remember, I stipulated that it's a naturally impossible event. I'm not, and so the reason for thinking, at least in my view, that they are evidence of God's revelation, again, is going to come from the context in which they appear. So again, if it's Jesus rising from the dead, and it's claimed that this is going to be the sign, right? It's predicted that this will be the sign that he is revealing God to us. That's why I take it to be evidence for God's revelation. I may not be understanding his question correctly, though, and that can just be on me.
I think you are. It's correct, right? It comes down to what I call that religion authenticating context. Like, what role is the miracle serving? And in this case, the resurrection in particular is serving to attest to the truth of Jesus's unique religious claims and therefore the truth of the religion itself, kind of thing. So that's the difference compared to just a random miracle that's unattached to some religious thing or something like that, right? So that, I don't know, hopefully that answers his question. I think that's what he was asking. We do have
James asked, well, I guess he made a comment, not a question, down here at the very bottom.
James, yeah, I'm trying to find this one. The resurrection is not physically impossible given what we know from modern physics. It is unique and not natural but it's not impossible.
Well, I mean, in that case, I'm not sure what is the distinction there between physical and natural, because it seems like you're saying it's not physically impossible, but it is naturally impossible. And I would take like physical and natural impossibility to be the same modality. So, I mean, maybe he's talking about like a resuscitation. Like we know you could like bring somebody. There's like what so-called Lazarus syndrome, where people can be like clinically dead but can come back to life a little bit later. I don't know if he's proposing that this is what's going on in the case of Jesus, because I mean, Jesus just 3 days and 3 nights is like way longer than the longest known example of a medical resuscitation.
Well, he gives an example. So and this will be interesting actually to get your take on it, kind of thing. So, for example, what physics are required to produce the shroud images, the Shroud of Turin? He's asking about, and yeah. So, first of all, I'm kind of curious. What is your take on the Shroud of Turin? But beyond that, in terms of answering his questions, he's trying to say like that whatever produced the shroud was physically impossible. That's a miracle, I think.
Yeah, this is just getting into obviously an area of your expertise, not an area of mine. I am told that I guess the image is supposed to be made by like light or something like that, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not. That is not again something that I've personally done a deep dive on. So, I mean, I'm open to the shroud being produced in a miraculous way. It's certainly not something I've ruled out. But I also realize I haven't done, near the level of research that someone like Dale has to like confidently say, I think the shroud is authentic.
All right, cool. All right, so we'll end off the stream with this one last one from Juan. So he's going back to your claim about the man flying, and he's saying, look, David, you're just being as equally incredulous of the claim of that the foreman decided to lie and became willing to die for it for some strange reason. Yeah, so like you're the pot telling the kettle black kind of thing is what he says.
I think the difference here is that we know certain things about human nature, right? We know that like one of the deepest inclinations of human beings is self-preservation, right? And that's not to say people won't ever place things above that, but when they do, it's for things that are very important to them because, generally speaking, our lives are really important to ourselves. So people are typically not going to die for a lie unless, maybe that lie is tied in some way to something else that's really important to them. We could think of maybe some weird examples where that would happen. But generally speaking, if it's something a person doesn't even believe, then they're not going to be willing to give up their life for it. That's something we know about human nature. So I don't think it's not just incredulity. Like, oh, I just can't believe that this would happen, or I'm a priori assuming it wouldn't happen. I'm saying I do know something about human nature that counts against this sort of thing happening.
Now he begs me to ask this one as the last one, his last one, but it's the same thing. But he's talking about forget about the lying thing. What about these 4 men having a mass hallucination? You're just assuming that's so absurd that therefore a man was flying becomes less absurd than that. So yeah, I'll let you have that final response, and then we will end off.
Yeah. So again, I think that in the case of 4 people having like the same hallucination, we know certain things about hallucinations and certain things about the human mind that are going to mitigate against the probability of this. I'm not saying it's absurd. I'm saying it's like ridiculously unlikely. With respect to like a man who's flying, I presume we're talking about like in a miraculous way, right? That he's flying as the result of like divine sort of intervention or something like that. If the idea is that a man was, flying without any sort of like mechanical aids or anything like that, and he was doing so naturally, then of course, like that's going to be something that we know to be naturally impossible as well. So yes, the same sorts of things that we know about like the constitution of the human body and gravity and things, these are going to come into play if that's a naturalistic hypothesis. My assumption was that you were asking about this as a different putative miracle that had the same evidence for the resurrection. and you're saying, would you believe in this resurrect or believe in this miracle on the basis of the same evidence? So, I mean, the reason why I'm discounting these other hypotheses is because I'm taking it that you're putting these forward as naturalistic hypotheses, and so they can be assessed relative to what we know about the sort of natural processes involved in, for example, hallucinations. Those sorts of factors will apply if you're saying that a man was flying naturally. On the other hand, if, as I had assumed, you were saying a man is flying miraculously, then it doesn't matter in those cases. It just goes into the inscrutable category. So I think that's the distinction there for your one.
All right, awesome. All right, cool. So with that, I will live up to my promise, and yeah, I think we'll end. But yeah, first of all, I want to say thank you so much, David, for coming on. It's been a thrill. It's been so long since we were co-hosts together on the PORA thing. I was the Theo Geeks, and you and David were the head honchos on PORA. So I loved having you come back and talk about this important topic. Hopefully, you enjoyed your time on your end.
Yeah, always good to talk with you, Dale. I'm sorry it's been so long, but I have been following you, have been a fan. Definitely was there for the conversation with David Falk and so on and so forth. So yes, really good to connect with you again.
Awesome. Yeah, you're welcome back anytime, any topics, any format, and I'd love to come on your show sometime if there's a topic you'd like to have me on to speak about sometime. And yeah. Other than that, thank you everyone in the audience. You guys were great questions, and yeah, that should be it for today. Now you're not done with me because this week I have 2 more podcasts. So tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I have Otangelo Grasso coming on. So speaking of the Shroud of Turin, he's sort of an expert on the use of AI technology in the Shroud, and I admit I'm kind of skeptical about the use of AI and using it. People, I think they're getting a little bit intellectually lazy using it for all their conclusions and writing papers and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see if Otangelo can convince me that this is a valid tool to use. And then also at 7 o'clock that night, Jamie Castro is coming on to talk about Jesus and apologetics. How did Jesus specifically, did he engage in apologetics and use philosophy and stuff like that to reason with people? So yeah, tune in for that. And otherwise, have a great day, everybody.